Take a Phillips screwdriver and loosen the carburetor hose clamp that goes to the intake boot. Wiggle the carburetor back and forth to remove it from the intake boot. Once the carburetor is free, take a 10mm wrench and loosen the lock nut on the throttle cable end to the carburetor. Once the lock nut is loosened, use your hand to unscrew the rest of the bolt from the carburetor. Then take the throttle cable nipple and pass it through the channel of the carburetor. Repeat these steps for the other carburetor. Each hand throttle cable housing is different from others. For mine, I had to use a Phillips head screwdriver to loosen the 2 screws for the hand throttle cable housing. Once the hand throttle cable housing is free, take the throttle cable and remove it from the hand throttle. Here are the items you're going to need. You need your torch, striker for the torch, wire strippers, flux. You're also going to need solder. The solder I used had 50% tin and then 50% lead. You're going to need your throttle cable kit and accessories that come with it, a cutting wheel or grinder, and of course your Mikuni carburetors. Now we're going to disassemble part of the carb so we can measure the length that we need for the carburetor housing. First, you want to remove the rubber cap for the top of the carburetor. Then unscrew the carburetor top mixing chamber. Be careful because the top mixing chamber has a spring beneath it, so when it's finished loosening, the top mixing chamber might go flying off. So keep firm pressure as you're trying to unscrew it. Open the bag that contains throttle cable accessories and make sure you have all the right parts. Parts that come in the bag are the brass barrel nipple that goes to the hand throttle, the brass throttle nipples that go to the 2 carburetors, the hand throttle cable sleeve. There should be 2 carb end cable sleeves, 1 for each carb. The last item is a universal part for other motorcycles, but we don't use it for this application. Next, we need to figure out how much exposed throttle cable we need to leave of the carburetor slide. First, you pass the exposed throttle cable to the top mixing chamber. Then you put the end of the throttle cable into the slide. Then you screw on the top mixing chamber to the carburetor. And then you just make a mark from where the top of the brass nipple is and maybe just leave like 1/10 of an inch excess just to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room because you could always adjust it later. Next, measure the mark you just made from the mark to the end of the throttle cable to know how much you're going to need to leave exposed. Next will be the time to figure out how long you want your cable to be. My original throttle cable has already been cut and shortened to the length I've needed, so I'm using my original throttle cable to measure the new length I want the new cables to be at. If you have new handlebars on or you want to shorten your throttle cables, this is the time to figure out exactly how much you want to shorten them. Take your cutting wheel and cut on the marks that you just made. The right carburetor's throttle cable end for the carburetor is going to be a little bit longer than the other because it has to reach over to the other side. Once all ends are cut, start on the carburetor throttle side end of the cables and take down that number that you measured earlier that we needed for the exposed cable length and use your tape measure to measure it out. Next, I just used a normal pair of wire strippers to remove the cable housing. You kind of have to clamp down hard and twist the cable around to kind of get a good cut into the housing, but it ends up working out perfect. Once that is done, you should have the exposed cable at the length that you measured earlier. Take the cable housing cap and slide the throttle cable through the cable housing cap. Once on there, take your wire strippers again and you use the end of the wire strippers to pinch and crimp the cable housing caps. Apply flux in the area where the brass throttle nipples are going to go. Once the flux is applied, take your torch and light it up using your striker. Next thing you want to do is heat up the flux and then take your solder and just quickly melt and drop it onto the area, and you'll see the solder will just kind of seep and pull into wherever the flux was. You can see how the solder will just spread and seeps into the area where the flux was. Heat up the throttle cable and then it will kind of remelt the solder, and then you slide over the brass throttle nipple into its place, and then the solder should harden back in securing the brass throttle nipple. Now use your bench grinding wheel to remove any excess exposed throttle cable, and you just want to grind it down to the very tip of the brass throttle nipple. Now I'm cutting the hand throttle end of the throttle cable to length using the measurements I took before by using my old throttle cable as a reference to how long I need it. Repeat the process you did for the throttle cable for the carburetor side. You want to dip the exposed throttle cable into the flux, heat up the flux, and then melt your solder on top of the area where the brass barrel nipple for the hand throttle is going to go. Next, I'm just going to show you how you reassemble the carburetor. First, take your rubber cap and slide it through your throttle cable for the carburetor side. Once that's done, take your throttle cable and pass it through the top mixing chamber of the carb, and then you'll see the throttle cable housing sits nicely in that brass nipple there. Take the spring for the throttle valve, and then you pass the throttle cable through that. I can press the spring down with my hand to keep the throttle cable exposed. Then you take the slide for the throttle valve, and then you put the brass nipple of the throttle cable through the little provision it has in the slide. Take your spring seat plate for the carb slide, and then that makes sure the throttle cable stays in place. Next, I'm going to show you, it's kind of hard to miss. I mean, the throttle slide can only go in one way into the carburetor, and you can see there is a slot cut out on the side of the slide, and then you can see there is a little nipple that sticks out on the inside of the carburetor, and basically that slot in the slide gets fed through that nipple right there. And then you just go ahead and screw on the top mixing chamber, and you make sure the cable housing cap is in the brass nipple of the top mixing chamber, and then use the rubber boot to cover it up. And then I went ahead and just pulled at the hand throttle end of the throttle cable and made sure that the slide was sure enough opening and closing when needed to. Next, I'm installing the plunger style choke on each of the carburetors. Take your 12mm wrench and loosen the plunger on the side of the carburetor. Once it's fully loosened, it just slides out as one full unit. Then you just take the new plunger style choke with the knurled ends, and you just place it in and you start threading it in by hand. Once it's taut with your hands, take your 12mm wrench and finish tightening it until it's just snug. You don't want to over tighten because you could risk stripping the threads. Once it is tight, just double check and just make sure the plunger works by pulling the plunger up and down. Next, we're going to route the throttle cable. It's important that you route this properly, or you're going to kink up the cable line. Therefore, when you twist the throttle, it's either not going to be a smooth action, or the cable is going to get bound up and pinched on something. Once you have the carburetors back on the intake boot and the hose clamp fully tightened using your Phillips head screwdriver, I then assembled the throttle cable for the carburetor side. I assembled all the carburetor pieces like we did earlier. So that completes the project. I hope all this information was helpful and useful. Just remember, I'm no different than anyone else. I just try to do everything by myself, and I rather try it. And if I mess up, it might be costly to fix it, but I know that I'll never make that same mistake twice. Don't be afraid to take chances and to try to figure things out on your own, because once you do, it's only going to help you for that next project you start, and it'll give you that confidence you need to keep the next project going.